In 1800, the Acts of Union were ratified by the British and Irish Parliaments, officially creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This century began with Britain still at war with revolutionary France. Whilst Napoleon devastated the coalition armies opposing him in mainland Europe, British actions were confined to naval blockade of France and her colonies. Attempts by neutral states to repulse British attacks and break the blockade were largely unsuccessful. In 1801, Admiral Nelson attacked and destroyed most of the Danish fleet in the Battle of Copenhagen, effectively neutering one of France's few allies. In 1802, the Treaty of Amiens was signed, bringing hostilities between Britain and France to a close. 1803 saw the Second Anglo-Maratha War break out. The Maratha Confederacy was the last major power opposing British rule in India, and when a client of the East India Company inherited large swathes of their territory, they could stand British incursions no longer. The fighting was bloody and saw Arthur Wellesley make a name for himself in the decisive Battle of Assaye. By 1805, the Maratha Confederacy was a spent force, and British power in India was assured. Around the same time, the British launched their first expedition against Kandy in what is now Sri Lanka. Britain had seized Dutch possessions on the island some years before, and internal friction within the Kandyan court led them to expand further into the island. Resistance was fierce, and Kandy guerrillas combined with tropical disease eventually forced the British back, but were unable to dislodge them from the island. No treaty was signed, but the area stabilised in 1805. 1803 also saw Emmet's rising in Ireland. Robert Emmet had been covertly manufacturing arms to equip a rebel Irish force, and in July they attempted a rising in Dublin. Several British officials were killed, but troops were able to suppress the rebellion. After some diplomatic friction over territorial rights, Britain had again declared war on France in May of 1803. Napoleon had already abandoned French possessions in America. His failure to suppress the Haitian Rebellion and selling of Louisiana to the US left Britain as the dominant European presence in the New World. The money from the Louisiana Purchase was used to finance an attempted invasion of the British Isles. 1804 was a relatively peaceful year. Napoleon consolidated his hold on power by being made emperor and formed a huge army with which to invade Britain. British Prime Minister William Pitt secured alliances with Sweden in 1804 and Russia in early 1805, creating the Third Coalition. Fears of French expansion into Italy drew Austria into the coalition a few months later. In late summer 1805, Napoleon crushed the Austrians in Bavaria before their allies could render military assistance to them. During the year, the French plans to invade the British Isles had come to a head. Despite the strong British naval presence in the Channel, Napoleon thought he would only need 6 hours in which to move his troops across, and ordered his admirals to prepare their forces. French fleets, making use of captured Spanish warships, harassed British possessions in the Caribbean as they attempted to consolidate. Nelson eventually caught the Franco-Spanish fleet after they returned to the European port of Cadiz to begin the invasion, and utterly destroyed them, though he himself was killed in the battle. The victory at Trafalgar removed French belief in their naval power for the rest of the war, and as such Britain's last major opponents on the seas for the next century. Despite the French defeat at sea, on land the Russo-Austrian coalition was destroyed at the Battle of Austerlitz, leading to the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German buffer states on the French border, and seeing the Austrian state crippled by war indemnities. In early 1806, Francis II abdicated the imperial throne, finally ending the existence of the Holy Roman Empire. Naturally, the conflict was far from over, and later the same year the War of the Fourth Coalition began as Prussia became alarmed by the expansion of French influence and joined Britain and Russia in continuing opposition. British support was largely financial, and by 1807 Napoleon was master of all of Western and Central Europe, excluding Spain and Austria, having roundly defeated both the Prussians and the Russians. Britain and Sweden were the only powers remaining in opposition to Napoleon. Between 1806 and 7, British forces were sent to take over Spanish possessions in South America around the River Plate Basin, but these attempts were unsuccessful and the British withdrew, having lost about half their forces. The success of the defenders without support from Spain fostered a rise of nationalism in South America and led to the Spanish viceroy being ousted. During the War of the Third Coalition, the French had signed a treaty with the Ottoman Empire to close the Straits of the Dardanelles to all but French shipping. In February 1807, a British fleet forced the straits in an attempt to force the Turkish hand. Despite defeating a Turkish squadron in the Sea of Marmara, rapidly constructed Turkish forts around Constantinople forced the British to withdraw. A later land expedition captured Alexandria but was unable to hold it. In 1809, under mounting pressure from Russia, the Ottoman Empire signed a peace treaty, affirming British trade interests in the area in return for protection from the French. Soon after war began with the Ottomans, British warships also recommenced hostilities against Denmark in an attempt to destroy the Danish fleet and deny their ships to the French. The Danes classed this as a continuation of a conflict begun by Nelson's destruction of the Danish fleet in 1801, calling it the English War, whilst this second section is known to British sources as the Gunboat War. The war began with the Second Battle of Copenhagen and saw intense naval skirmishing between British ships of the line and smaller Danish gunboats. The British forces generally had the upper hand, raiding merchant shipping in the small Danish islands, though several British warships were lost. The war ended in 1814, with Britain gaining control of the Heligoland and Denmark surrendering control of Norway to Sweden. The British attack on Copenhagen forced the Tsar of Russia to declare war on Britain, despite their erstwhile alliance against Napoleon. The Russian defeat in 1807 had forced the Tsar to sign a humiliating treaty, obligating him to sever ties with Britain. Understanding the Russian position, the British attempted to limit the impact of the war, and few major engagements occurred, although the Royal Navy enjoyed successes in some minor battles. 1807 also saw Britain begin land operations against Napoleon on the continent in the form of the Peninsular War. Franco-Spanish forces had invaded Portugal, Britain's ally since 1373, and occupied the country. In 1808, British forces under Arthur Wellesley landed in Portugal and drove the French forces back. Wellesley was replaced as commander due to his lack of seniority at around the time Napoleon turned on his Spanish ally and invaded Spain. The British forces advanced into Spain to assist the Spanish but were repulsed. The French tried to drive them back and overrun Portugal but were held in the mountainous passes by British forces and Portuguese militia. The Spanish populace began the first major guerrilla war in history, indeed coining the term, and wreaked havoc on the French occupiers. In 1809, Wellesley resumed command of the British forces. After strengthening his position in Portugal, he advanced once again into Spain and won the title of Duke of Wellington after the victory at Talavera. In the same year, British forces helped the Portuguese conquer French Guiana. British attempts at liberating Spain were unsuccessful, and by 1810 French control of the country was absolute. Spain effectively ceased to be a great power at this time. The next 2 years saw inconclusive fighting along the Portuguese border, which the French were unable to penetrate thanks to the strong fortifications. 1812 saw Wellington capture Barcelona and decisively defeat the French at Salamanca. By the end of 1812, Napoleon had more pressing concerns in Europe and withdrew most of his forces from Spain. The next year was spent encircling and destroying the remaining French, with Wellington leaving the last pockets of resistance to his subordinates to join the advance into France in late 1830. The advance into France was precipitated by the War of the Sixth Coalition. The War of the Fifth Coalition had occurred in 1809, in which Austria attempted to preemptively reassert power over France and was defeated disastrously, facing a very harsh settlement. British troops had been sent to aid the Austrians in the Low Countries but achieved very little. In 1812, Napoleon decided to invade Russia, sending over 500,000 men into a lengthy and ultimately unsuccessful invasion of the huge country. In July 1812, Britain formally announced peace with Russia, and by March of 1813 had joined the coalition with her, alongside Sweden and Prussia. Despite losses suffered in Russia, Napoleon quickly reassembled his forces, drafting many from the German states in the Confederation of the Rhine. In spite of this, French forces were slowly pushed back, with Allied forces advancing from Russia, the German states, Austria and Spain. In October 1813, the largest battle in European history at that time was fought between 600,000 men at Leipzig, with Napoleon facing his first decisive defeat. Napoleon withdrew into France to bolster his final defences. Wellington advanced in the southwest, achieving several victories, including the Battle of Toulouse in April 1814. Napoleon won several small engagements in attempts to keep the Allies from Paris, but by this time he was outnumbered 5-1 in terms of troops and hopelessly outclassed in quality. Facing a mutiny by his generals, he agreed to abdicate on the 11th of April 1814. Back in 1811, the British possessions in South Africa, conquered from the French allied Batavian Republic in 1806, had been encroached upon by the native Xhosa tribe, who were promptly pushed back by a mixed British and Boer force. More land was subsequently claimed by the Europeans, and the settlement of Grahamstown was founded upon the East Cape. In 1812, British forces had also been occupied in the Americas. British restrictions on trade to Europe and impressment of American sailors, combined with a debatable level of US expansionist sentiment and desire for greater economic productivity, led the US to declare war on Britain in June 1812. As British forces were largely occupied with fighting Napoleon, the Royal Navy blockading all of Western Europe and much of the regular army being on land in the peninsula, much of the fighting in North America was left to the regular and militia Canadian forces. US forces were unprepared for war, however, and were stymied in 2 attempts to invade Canada. Several naval battles were fought on the Great Lakes, and US victory there cut off Britain from the coalition of native forces that had been aiding them. The Royal Navy was more successful on open sea, finding enough ships to blockade the US coastline and cripple American agriculture. After Napoleon's abdication, Parliament was able to divert more men and shipping to the war effort, and in August of 1814 a large British force made a landing in Maryland, defeated US forces at Bladensburg, and captured Washington, D.C., burning much of the city to the ground in retaliation for US raids in Canada. A few weeks later, British ships attempted to capture Baltimore, but despite a heavy bombardment were unable to destroy the fortifications, the defiance of which inspired the writing of the US national anthem. On the 24th of December, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, marking peace between the US and Britain. Restoring the status quo ante bellum, no territories changed hands, nor were reparations demanded. News of the signing did not immediately reach the US, and on the 8th of January 1815, British forces were soundly defeated at the Battle of New Orleans. Following the war, the US and Britain began to cooperate much more openly, with much animosity having been spent by the fighting. In February 1815, British forces again moved into Kandy in Sri Lanka, after news arrived that the Kandyan nobility wanted help to depose their king. Little resistance was met, and by March of the same year, Britain had annexed Kandy into the British Indian possessions. On the 1st of March 1815, Napoleon returned from exile in Elba and was met in France by rabid support. Marching towards Paris, he began to amass an army, arriving on the 20th. The Congress of Vienna branded him an outlaw immediately and began mobilizing forces. This was the war of the seventh and final coalition. On the 15th of June, Napoleon's forces launched preemptive strikes against the Prussians. Several battles followed before the Anglo-Allied forces met Napoleon at Waterloo and decisively held against repeated French attacks. The arrival of the Prussians finally broke the resolve of the French imperial forces for the last time. On the 22nd of June, Napoleon abdicated the throne of France, removing the last major obstacle to British global dominance. The social upheaval of this period would continue to shape the European world, as anti-autocratic populist sentiment would continue to thrive and spread, despite the efforts of European monarchies to contain them. Outside Europe, in 1817, the Third Anglo-Maratha War broke out. The Maratha had been preparing to challenge the British presence for some time, and finally had their chance when British forces launched an expedition to destroy bands of raiders that had been attacking British territory. Despite the Maratha preparations, however, the technological and logistical advantages of the British forces would prove decisive, and within a year almost the entirety of the Indian subcontinent fell into British hands. In 1818, British forces again engaged the Xhosa in conflict, when tribal forces attacked the new settlement of Grahamstown. Again, the British pushed them back and created an even larger buffer zone in South Africa, soon to be called the Albany District. In 1821, the population of Greece rebelled against their Ottoman overlords. The European powers were unsure how to respond. Despite the weakening power of the Ottoman Empire, few knew how to handle this rebellion, particularly as fears of populist risings were still fresh in many minds. However, by 1826 the government's stance had changed. Public support for the Greeks was high, and Britain and Russia were mediating with the Ottomans to support the Greek cause. A heavy-handed Ottoman response provoked the deployment of the British Mediterranean fleet directly into Greek waters. In October 1827, a combined British, French and Russian fleet, by a series of mistakes, were drawn into battle with an allied Egyptian and Ottoman fleet and utterly destroyed them at Navarino. By 1828, after strong international pressure, the Ottoman Empire allowed for Greek independence. In 1823, the Ashanti tribe of the former Gold Coast, now Guyana, launched an attack on British troops and killed several. The tribe were the most powerful non-European force in West Africa and were unhappy with British efforts to curtail the international slave trade, from which they derived a great deal of income. The First War raged on for 8 years and saw several humiliating defeats of British forces before they eventually curtailed Ashanti expansion through the use of rockets and artillery at the Battle of Accra. In India, the expansion of the Burmese Empire was beginning to cause some concerns. Their encroachment into the northeast of the region, along with the conquest of British-claimed Shalpuri Island, alarmed the East India Company, who began to fund rebels to launch attacks across the border. This outraged the Burmese government, and in March 1824 British and Burmese forces met in battle. Burmese experience in the theatre afforded them several early victories as they cut a swathe into Bengal. By September 1825, however, British forces had made enormous gains into Burmese territory, where once again their superiority in weapons devastated the opposing forces. An armistice was temporarily signed, but talk broke down and the Burmese attempted a final massive attack on the British. They encircled the main British force in the city of Prome, but heavy artillery and supporting fire from gunboats utterly destroyed the Burmese. The peace treaty gained Britain Assam, Manipur, Arakan and the Tenasserim coast, and left the Burmese kingdom economically crippled. The high cost of the war in terms of money and lives, however, greatly alarmed the British government, which then stripped the East India Company of many privileges. In 1828, British Marines assisted in the repression of a revolt by foreign mercenaries in Brazil in a short but bloody confrontation. In the same year, a civil war began in Portugal. The British supported the Liberal faction, who asserted that King Miguel I was a usurper. Miguel drove many Liberals out of the country and began a period of repression. His brother Pedro travelled from Brazil to Britain, where he gathered support and prepared to invade. By 1832 he had made landings with British and French naval support. Sir Charles Napier of the Royal Navy actually commanded the Liberal fleet and aided greatly in Pedro's eventual victory the following year. In December 1831, Baptist preacher Samuel Sharp, in response to growing abolitionist sentiment in Britain, organised a protest in Jamaica and demanded wages for the slaves. Almost 60,000 joined him, and when their demands were not met, a riot broke out. The Great Jamaican Slave Revolt was quickly put down, but the brutality of the plantocracy's response has been argued to have advanced the process of abolition. The devastation wrought in Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, along with the collapse of its trade and prestige as it lost control of its empire, most notably Mexico in 1821, had left the country in turmoil. By 1833 this boiled over into civil war, as debates of royal succession and international debt became flamed to the powders of civil unrest. The British supported the liberal Isabella against the Carlists, who hoped for a return to absolute monarchy. Fighting raged across Spain and was exceptionally cruel before the Carlists, almost universally opposed by all European powers, with the notable exception of Miguel I of Portugal before his removal, were defeated. One notable impact of British involvement was the Lord Eliot Convention, in which indiscriminate executions were prohibited. British support, typically, was largely economic and naval. 1834 saw a further Xhosa War break out. The ceded territories were a bone of contention for the Xhosa, whilst Zulu expansion into the opposite side of their territory was a cause of great concern. Many Xhosa were dispossessed and resorted to raiding of British farms, which met a violent response from the Cape government. In the December of 1834, the Xhosa, enraged, launched a massive attack on the Albany district, killing many settlers and driving hordes of refugees before them. The British governor mobilised a force of Boers, natives and regular troops to respond, and launched a reprisal campaign that once again drove back the Xhosa. Many surrendered before their paramount chief was brought to negotiate. Even greater swathes of territory were added to British South Africa, forming Queen Adelaide Province, in which all residents were declared British citizens, including many who had been displaced by Zulu expansion. On the 20th of June, 1837, King William IV died, bringing to an end the Regency era. His successor would give her name to the greatest period in British imperial history, and usher in a golden age of discovery, conquest and prosperity. His niece, Queen Victoria.